Dobré odpoledne, dámy a pánové. Já bych rád zahájil webinář, který je věnován především prezentaci Mycla Schneidera, hlavního autora a koordinátora projektu World Nuclear Industry Status Report. A chtěl bych vás pozvat na jeho prezentaci, v níž budou shrnuty hlavní závěry letošního reportu, který byl publikován na konci září. Já se jmenuji Karel Polanecký, pracuji v Hnutí DUHA a mým úkolem je dnešní webinář moderovat. Pokud jde o program, tak ten bude poměrně jednoduchý. Po úvodních slovech bude následovat samotná prezentace Mycla Schneidera a poté bude prostor pro vaše dotazy. Ty dotazy můžete už prezentaci dávat prostřednictvím ikony Question and Answers, která je ve spodním liště v Zoomu, a zkusíme na co největší množství dotazů odpovědět. Máme prostor do 16. hodiny, takže doufám, že se nám to podaří. Prosím vás, nepoužívejte k pokládání dotazů četovací okno, to je vyhrazeno pro technickou komunikaci, tam nám napište v případě, že byste měli problém s tím, že špatně slyšíte nebo neslyšíte překlad nebo něco podobného. Ještě než si vyslechneme úvodní slova, tak bych chtěl upozornit, že shrnutí publikace World Nuclear Industry Status Report z letošního roku bylo přeloženo i do češtiny na webových stránkách. Vám zašleme, případně si ho můžete přečíst i v tiskové zprávě. Ještě bych chtěl upozornit, že dnešní webinář je nahráván a záznam originálu prezentace bude také zveřejněn na webových stránkách. Už bych na začátek poprosil paní Adélu Jurečkovou, ředitelku pražské kanceláře nadace Heinrich-Bo, která je sponzorem dnešního webináře a zároveň dlouhodobě podporuje projekt World Nuclear Industry Status Report, o úvodní slovo.
Já děkuji, přeji vám dobré odpoledne. Jménem pražské pobočky Heinrich-Bo vás také vítám na prezentaci letošní zprávy o stavu jaderného průmyslu ve světě. Její české vydání jsme podpořili. A myslím si, že poznatky z té letošní zprávy jsou cenným příspěvkem do té současné debaty o energetice v Česku a v Evropě. A to z několika důvodů. Jednak zažíváme výrazný nárůst cen energií a vede se intenzivní diskuze o příčinách tohoto nárůstu a dopadech na spotřebitele. Některé aspekty toho cenového vývoje se ve veřejné a mediální reflexi možná trochu přeceňují, jiné zase podceňují. Každopádně tahle aktuální zkušenost rozmíchává debatu o energetické soběstačnosti, kde je atomová energie někdy prezentována jako jedna z možných cest, jak ji zvýšit. Za druhé, debatu o jádru živí také plán Evropské zelené dohody, která chce přispět k zpomalení globálního oteplování podporou bezemisních zdrojů energie. Právě takovou technologickou alternativou je podle některých i energie z jádra, zvláště země s vysokým podílem jaderné energie na svém energetickém mixu, jako je třeba Francie, ale také Česko se k ní připojuje a další státy lobují za to, aby jádro v rámci implementace Green Dealu platilo za obnovitelný zdroj, především v rámci taxonomie, která je vodítkem pro investory. A pokud bude tedy jaderná energie do této taxonomie začleněna, tak budou do jaderného průmyslu dále proudit investice. Za třetí, Německo se chystá už příští rok ukončit provoz všech svých jaderných elektráren, jak vláda rozhodla po havárii ve Fukušimě. Zároveň chce ale ukončit i výrobu energie z uhlí. A pokud bude složení nové vlády takové, jak se nyní zdá, tak se to stane nejspíš už výrazně dříve, než v tom původně plánovaném roce 2038. V Česku se německé Energiewende věnuje hodně pozornosti, její obraz je ale často negativní, plný obav z případných negativních dopadů na Česko. A konečně za čtvrté, novou českou vládu bude čekat s vypsání tendru na plánovanou výstavbu Dukovan. V tuto chvíli ještě vláda současná hodnotí bezpečnostní dotazníky od uchazečů z Francie, USA a Jižní Koreje. A nová vláda by ten tendr teoreticky mohla pozměnit nebo i případně úplně zrušit. Debaty o všech těchto aspektech tedy udržují jádro v centru naší pozornosti. V Česku přitom stojí v popředí především jeho pozitivní anebo jenom taky čistě technicistní aspekty a mnohem méně jsou slyšet hlasy, které by upozorňovaly i na rizika a nevýhody spojené s provozem jaderných elektráren, jako je bezpečnost nebo problém se skladováním radioaktivního odpadu. Je to zvláštní, pokud to porovnáme třeba s debatou o klimatické spravedlnosti. Požadavky na důslednější ochranu klimatu totiž často čerpají svoji legitimitu z argumentu, že není spravedlivé zanechat budoucím generacím planetu stíhanou suchem a přírodními katastrofami. A je tady otázkou, proč se nebavíme vlastně i o tom, jestli je spravedlivé, když po sobě budoucím generacím zanecháme tuny radioaktivního odpadu. Otázek, které si v této souvislosti můžeme klást, je určitě mnohem víc. Můžeme se na ten problém podívat třeba taky z pozic geopolitiky a nebo z pohledu ekonomického a porovnat, do jaké míry se výroba energie z jádra vyplatí oproti jiným zdrojům, ať už fosilním nebo obnovitelným. A i toho se určitě v následující prezentaci a následné diskuzi dotkneme. Já už se na obojí moc těším a proto bych chtěla na závěr už jenom poděkovat Kale i Hnutí DUHA za spolupráci na dnešním webináři a všem přítomným popřát důležité, zajímavé poznatky a poděkovat jim za zájem o tohle důležité téma.
A o druhé úvodní slovo požádám pana Edvarda Sekvence z pořádající organizace Kala.
Přeji dobrý den všem. Já navážu na Adélu Jurečkovou, která již zmínila, že česká vláda a Česko stojí na prahu tendru na nové jaderné reaktory, respektive jeden reaktor v Dukovanech. Nová vláda, zdá se, nebo politické strany, které ji budou skládat, vyslovují podporu pro tento tendr a je tedy dost pravděpodobné, že bude vypsán. Jenom zmíním, že měl být už v loni. Bylo velmi hodně slov, že bude do konce roku 2020 a už i tady máme zpoždění. V každém případě došlo v minulých měsících k politickému rozhodnutí o vyřazení čínských a ruských dodavatelů, takže osloveni pro bezpečnostní dotazník nakonec byly jenom 3 země, respektive 3 možní dodavatele, a to je americký Westinghouse, francouzská EDF a korejské KNP. Přičemž poslední 2 jmenovaní nemají vhodný typ reaktoru pro Dukovany, kde je poměrně limitována velikost 1200 MW maximálně kvůli chlazení a možnému vyvedení výkonu. Momentálně nemají takový reaktor k dispozici, nikdo si letní neobjednal. Předpokládám, že o rizicích stavby prototypových reaktorů bude během dnešní přednášky také krátce řeč. Pokud jde o ten časový harmonogram, do konce listopadu mají všechny 3 firmy předložit bezpečnostní dotazník, poté se jim budou věnovat bezpečnostní komunita, vláda. Nečekám, že k vypsání tendru by došlo dříve jak v prosinci, spíše v lednu příštího roku. To, co by určitě měl ale tendr obsahovat, to je právě požadavek na nějaký referenční projekt od dodavatelů, aby jsme se nedostali do problémů, který s prototypy souvisí. A měl by také mít dobře uspůsobenou dodávku na klíč, tak aby případné prodlužování a finanční náklady s tím spojené nenesl ČEZ, respektive český spotřebitel. A s tím souvisí i legislativní úprava. V minulých měsících byla definitivně přijata, už vyšla ve Sbírce zákonů tzv. Lex Dukovany, který dává ten rámec pro veřejnou podporu nových reaktorů, nejenom toho dukovanského, 100% až 100% půjčku ze státního rozpočtu pro firmu ČEZ, Ta se potom má splácet od doby zprovoznění reaktoru do dalších 30, možná až 60 let. Zákon umožňuje až do konce životnosti toho reaktoru. A to, co nám tam velmi chybí, je limitace, horní limit této garantované ceny, protože až vláda potom rozbalí ty nabídky z tendru a uvidíte reálné ceny, ne ty, o kterých mluvil ministr Havlíček, tak bude jasně vidět, že bude potřeba dávat štědrou veřejnou podporu další desítky let. Čeká nás také samozřejmě notifikace této podpory Evropské komise, ale to nebude úplně předmět dnešní debaty. Takže možná já očekávám také odpovědi na otázku, zda je vůbec reálné mít postavený nový reaktor za 7 let, tak jako uvažuje česká vláda a firma ČEZ. Zda nejdeme proti směrům vývoje světového, evropského, pokud tady chceme stavět nejenom nový reaktor v Dukovanech, ale uvažujeme i o dalších 2 v Temelíně, případně o dalším ještě druhém v Dukovanech. Já vám moc děkuju, že se účastníte tohoto dnešního našeho webináře. Těším se na tu debatu.
Děkuji za úvodní slovo Eduardu Sekvencovi a nyní už bych rád požádal pana Mycla Schneidera o nasdílení prezentace a její přednesení.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for organizing this event. Thank you very much for inviting us to present this year's report. Maybe as a little background, this is a report which is now come out annually in one form or another since 2007. And it has considerably been developed as much in terms of the contributing authors. This year we have 13 authors from 7 countries contributing from some very distinguished research organizations like Harvard Kennedy School or Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London, one of the top-rated think tanks, and universities in Germany and Canada and Tokyo. So it's the attempt really to have an interdisciplinary team to do a multi-indicator analysis over the long term, because energy policy and nuclear policy need to be looked at over the long term. So I'll also mention just briefly that we were honored with the foreword by former Prime Minister of Japan, Naoto Kan, who was in charge during the events of Fukushima in March 2011. Now let me go into the assessment. This is the development of programs, national programs of nuclear power as they have come up. And we see that most of the countries have been developing their nuclear programs until the end of the 1980s. The Czech Republic was one of the last ones to start up its program. And we've seen the recent editions of Belarus and UAE in 2020, and before there was a long time only Iran that was added to the number of countries operating new reactors, so coming into the game as a nuclear energy using country. So in the past 30 years, only 5 new countries were added, while 2 phased out. Over the entire history, 3 countries phased out: Lithuania, Kazakhstan, and Italy. Now, I don't know why this goes away. This is very strange. If we look at the nuclear energy generation, nuclear electricity generation, we see that by far the largest producer is the United States, still operating 93 reactors. We see that the top 5 usually contribute about 2/3 to 3/4 of the nuclear electricity in the world. So it's very much concentrated to a small number of countries. The event in 2020 that happened was that China passed France as the second largest nuclear electricity generator. Interestingly enough, this was passed without any major public notice. We see that while China has become a large generator in terms of their share of electricity, it's still very low. It's below 5% still. So a large generator, but a share that remains quite low. We see France is still the highest, although there was a significant drop over the past few years with 67%. We have the US, very similar, is a large generator, but generates only about 20% of its electricity by nuclear power. The Czech Republic is generating power to a point where it's now in the, I think, 7th position, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8th position in the world with 37%. Now, if we look at the evolution of nuclear electricity production, we see that we had this rise until 2006 with a maximum, historic maximum, and then we had this plateau and this significant drop after the events in Fukushima, and we had a significant increase then year by year since 2012, and in 2020 this very large drop. Like if we look at the overall figure, it's almost 4% decline of the nuclear electricity generation in the world. That's over 100 terawatt hours. It's interesting to see that over 100 terawatt hours is a figure that is larger than 28 of the 33 nuclear countries generate during the year. So this drop is really quite substantial. Now, the other point here, we see that the share of nuclear in the electricity mix has been declining since 1996, continuously from 17.5% to around 10% in 2020. The other obvious phenomenon is the significance of the role of China in these statistics, and we will see that also for other major statistics, China is playing a very large role. Now, if we actually take China out and look at the rest of the world, we see that the drop was over 5% in the rest of the world, and that brings us to the lowest level of nuclear electricity generation since 1995. So a significant drop. The next indicator we look at continuously is reactor startups and closures. We see that we have peaked these numbers in the middle of the 1980s with 33 grid connections. For us, the actual indicator is grid connection and grid disconnection. So it's not the economic or political decision to close a reactor that has maybe not generated power for a long time, as it happened in Japan, and in particular, where a number of reactors were stranded, didn't produce any power after the catastrophe started in 2011. But the decision was only taken recently to take them permanently off the grid. We look at the last year of electricity generation and update retroactively. That is the reason why this bar in 2011 has become longer and longer over the years, with more reactors having been announced as closing permanently. So we see that in 2020 we had 5 reactors starting up and 6 closing down. So far we have seen 4 startups in 2021, and we have seen 2 closures, one in Taiwan and one in the US. We look again at the role that China plays in this picture, and it's obvious, it becomes very clear that over the past decade, China was the domination here when it comes to new grid connections, and this is also true like for the past few years with China, half of the startups this year and 2 of 5 in 2020. It was actually as much as 8 in 10 in 2015. If we take China out of the picture, we see that after this build-up in the 1970s and the 1980s and the rest of the world, for the past 30 years, very little happened. And most of the years, there were not even 5 startups for much larger closures, permanent closures. So in total, in the world, there were 95, including China, there were 95 startups, 98 closures. So that is by 3 negative. But if we take China out with its 47 startups over these 2 decades, then we see that the net balance actually outside is minus 50 reactors. So we actually see a decline of the world nuclear fleet that has been ongoing for quite some time. Now we look at the number of operating nuclear reactors and the operating capacity. We see this rise until the end of the 1980s, this plateau with a maximum of operating units in 2002. And we see this drop after 3/11, and this slight increase to a level of 450 by mid-2021. 415 reactors, to put that into perspective, we already had in 1989 418 reactors. So this remains still below this level 30 years ago, and it remains significantly below the maximum of 2002. But interestingly enough, we have reached by mid-year a new maximum operating capacity, which is interesting because we've seen that we had this in 2020, this large generation drop. So we'll see what 2021 will bring in terms of the overall electricity generation. Next indicator is reactors under construction. We also see here an early peak in 1979 with 234 units. And we have seen over the past few years always around 50 reactors. By mid-2021, we had 53 in the statistics. It's been around 50 for the past 5 years. It had sort of increased after a historic low in 2005, which was so low that you have to go back to the beginning of the nuclear age to find such low figures. It had gone up to 69, but stabilizing around 50 in the statistics for the past years. Now, it's important to see that many of these reactors actually don't get to the grid. And we have looked at that in more detail, and we have currently 93 reactors that were officially under construction. Now, under construction, used as a technical term, means that this is the beginning of the concreting of the base mat of the foundation of the reactor building. So it does not include all site preparation, licensing procedures, public participation, everything that needs to be done to get to that point. Reactors that were beyond that point, some of them even entirely built, never made it to the grid. And we see that the largest number was in the United States of reactor constructions that have been abandoned at some point. Globally, it's every 8th reactor construction has been abandoned, 1 in 8. And we see that there's a couple of them, the most recent ones in 2017. Those were 2 AP1000 reactors at the VC Summer site. They were abandoned particularly after the bankruptcy of the builder Westinghouse, the largest historic builder. And we're now seeing, this is an Associated Press piece from last week, where the executive of the electricity utility that was building these 2 reactors has to go to jail for 2 years because he has been misleading the public and the regulators, and it's clear that this cost billions. There were 9 rate increases during that construction time. And we will also see other, including Westinghouse officials, that have been charged with misleading the public and the regulators. Back to the statistics. Amongst these 53 reactors that are under construction, no surprise here that the main builder is China with 18 units of those 53, then India with 7, South Korea with 4, Russia with 3. We also see that we have over 31 units that we have documented as being behind schedule. That doesn't mean the others are not behind schedule, but it's, when they just started building, it's very difficult to say when they start getting behind planning. We also see that there is some units have been under construction for decades, including in Slovakia, and the record holder here is in Iran that first started building at Bushehr 2 in 1976. We're looking always into times construction times. Here it actually should say 2011 to 2020 up here. Mistake in the slide. We looked and we see that it's been stabilizing over the past few years at around 10 years. Average construction time with a huge range from around 4 years record. One reactor that was built at that record time in China, up to over 40 years, a reactor that was built in the United States. Now we looked in more detail at the 20 reactors that were started up in the past 3 years, 2018 to 2020. Of those 20, 11 were in China. No surprise here again. And you can see that roughly the estimated time for building was around 4 to 5 years. We have here the Westinghouse AP1000 reactors at Haiyang and Sanmen, and we have the Taishan reactors that are EPRs that were very optimistic with planned expected construction time. Interesting also that we had the 2 SMRs, Academic Lomonosov in Russia, these floating reactors, the only small modular reactors that have actually come online. And that was supposed to be the demonstration project that they're to build easy, fast, and cheaply. Now, if we look actually the real construction times, or the time from construction start to grid connection, sometimes that they get interrupted, like in Russia, for a long time, and then restart construction. So we see that roughly most of the construction times are twice of what was planned, with just two exceptions in China that were built on time. We also see that particularly problematic were the 2 small modular reactors that were meant to be built so quickly. I should also say that there are a number of EPRs that are still under construction in Europe. EPR means European Pressurized Water Reactor. It is a design that has been developed post-Chernobyl. And it's interesting to see that 35 years after the catastrophe in Chernobyl took place, we still have not a single EPR in operation in Europe. The Finnish plant was started up building in 2005 and expected to generate power by 2009. It's now 16 years in the making, and still it's still counting. Same thing for Flamanville, that started building in 2007, planned for 2012, now 14 years in the making and still counting. With the cost estimates exploded. The Court of Accounts in France has estimated the overall investment costs, including financing, to 19 billion. That is almost 10 times as much the original estimate when the political decision was actually made to build these facilities. And the Hinkley Point C plants are always way behind schedule. The builder, EDF Energy, 100% subsidiary of EDF, had the former boss had announced that they would be ready, Hinkley Point would be ready to cook the turkey for 2017 Christmas. Well, that didn't really work out. They started construction only in 2018 and 2019, and startup is currently planned for 2026-27. So if we look at the number of construction starts, they peaked in the mid-70s already with 44 in 1976. And we see that 11 of those did not make it to the grid, and we have this one reactor at Bushia, which is still under construction. We see that over the past few years, it was like 5 or 6 construction starts per year. Now, obviously these reactors are still, that are in green, are still under construction. If we look at the role of China, well, most obviously, China has been dominating construction starts massively over the past decade, up to 10 in 15 construction starts in 2010, the year prior to 3/11. We also see that to what extent Fukushima had a massive impact on the Chinese program. In 2011, there was no construction start whatsoever. And in 2014, there was no construction start. In fact, China froze new licenses for reactor building for 4 years until 2015, when new licenses were given. Those 7, I think it was 7 units that were started up building in 2012 and 2013 were considered so far in the pipeline that they let them go. We're taking China out, and we see that it's really down to a trickle, the number of construction starts in the world. Now, that means obviously that the evolution of age has been dramatically different between China and other countries. We see it's the only country of the top 5 that is below 10 years average age now. South Korea is over 20 years. Russia is around 28. France is getting towards 36. And the United States now is over 40 years average age. This is end of 2020 numbers. The average world age of the reactor fleet is getting towards 31 years. And we see that the Czech Republic is just under 30 years, so it's very close to the world average. Now, we always have a number of focus chapters. One is on the United States, and one specific issue here we were interested in was so-called early closures. We see here the case studies of 23 units subject to early closures over the time frame 2009 to 2025. And we see that most of those that have been already closed and the ones that are committed for closure or that have been reversed have already had licenses for operation to up to 60 years. And they were closed much earlier, mainly for economic reasons, sometimes for technical reasons. And we see that in some cases, like in Diablo Canyon, that has a phase-out plan, the licenses were, license extension applications were withdrawn because it has been decided to close them down early. Interesting is that two plants with 4 reactors at Byron and Dresden in Illinois just got a month ago got a license, a very massive subsidy granted to continue operating. These reactors were uneconomic under the conditions in the US grid, and they got a cash subsidy over 5 years of $700 million to keep them online. The early closures were reversed for Davis, Bessie, and Perry by a subsidy legislation, but it turned out that last year that this legislation was actually being implemented under a corruption scheme, a quite amazing corruption scheme involving 60 million in bribes to enact a 1.3 billion bailout of First Energy. It's really a stunning conspiracy that was revealed by the FBI, and obviously there is not only the Speaker of the House was arrested, but a whole range of First Energy, the utility officials. Back to the situation in Europe. Here we have a focus chapter on France. We see the electricity generation over the past 3 decades, and we see that we had a historic peak in 2005, as well as in terms of production as the share of nuclear power, and we see this significant decline in production and share over the past few years. 2020, the drop was almost 12%, so it's a really dramatic decline in output. That is the lowest level of production since 1992, and the share dropped to 67.1%, which is the lowest share since 1985. Now, while some of this decline is due to COVID-19 issues, it's very clear that France has a big problem with technical issues. We see here an analysis reactor by reactor of outages. Now, these outages, much longer than initially planned, accumulated 115 days per reactor. So it's almost a third of the time that these reactors, like close to 6,500 reactor days with 0 production. This does not include reduction of output. This is exclusively days when the reactors are completely off-grid. All 56 operating reactors were affected, and obviously with a large range from a few days to the entire year of outage. Also, we actually did in 2020 decide to have a chapter that we called Nuclear Power and Criminal Energy, because with these huge affairs in the United States, we actually looked. We have been documenting problems of criminality in the nuclear industry over many years, and in fact, in the 2020 World Nuclear Industry Status Report also already mentions the term corrupt 14 times throughout the report in 9 countries, and we thought, well, maybe there is a systemic issue, and so you might find it interesting, and it's quite stunning to what extent this actually has been a phenomenon that goes through most of the nuclear countries. This is an overview reactor by reactor of irregularities in the documentation of the component manufacturing at the Creusot Forge. Now, components that are forged there are mainly large components. We're talking about steam generators or primary or vessel heads or pieces of other pieces of reactor vessels. So very major, very significant pieces. And it was found starting in 2016 that in the end, over 5 decades, there were thousands of anomaly reports with multiple irregularities per component. So it very clearly was a systemic problem in the industry in France. And if we look around in Korea, we had the same kind of problem. For example, in 2012, a huge scandal broke that concerned several reactors operating as well as under construction. And 1 year later, another problem turned up in control command cabling. I mean, these cables are significant because they are the cables that actually send the signals from the operating system to safety significant systems like pumps and valves in the reactor from the control room. So again, this was those are two affairs that were very significant in the first one, where qualification certificates were forged. 60 different ones covering 7,682 components over a long period between 2003 and 2012. So again, a problem that has been ongoing for many years. And we see that in South Korea, this had a significant impact on generation, because these reactors had to be shut down, taken off the grid to be inspected. And we see another phenomenon in Korea here, big drop, much closer in the past 5 years. This was due to a technical issue called liner plate corrosion. That is the liner plate inside the containment of the reactors. And it turned out that of 24 operating reactors, 21 were found to have corrosion in those liner plates. And another problem was they had voids in the containment structure. A blip on Germany. We have been updating this graph to clarify that over the past few years, not only Germany has been starting to phase out nuclear power, so we see here the difference in system in the pre-Fukushima year 2020 and in 2010, and in the difference with 2020. So not only the significant reduction in nuclear output, but a fossil fuel reduction that is almost twice as big than the nuclear reduction. And how was it possible? Well, two main factors. One is the decrease in consumption, and the other is a massive increase in renewable electricity generation, which is now, as you can see, almost double what was reduced on the nuclear electricity side. A few words on SMRs, small modular reactors. There are now several programs in various countries. We see here construction that started in Argentina in 2014, but in the end of 2020, only at 70% complete. China has been building since 2012. It was supposed to be finished in 2017. It has become critical, that was reported, but it's still apparently not on the grid yet, so very late. And the Russian floating reactors we have seen with great delays. But we also see that the first years of generation are very low, with load factors 19 and 16%. I will jump this and will briefly report about the nuclear resilience chapter. we have had two contributing authors cooperating on this. We did a general overview and a case study on France. And this is really interesting because there's some big surprises to this issue, and literature is very poor yet on this issue. So it's a very interesting outcome. So what we see in an assessment of 6 years of operation, there were 357 outages, reactor outages, identified as linked to climate issues. That means at least several dozen disruptions per year, and about 100 reactor days, up to 100 reactor days lost in a year, which is not that much if we look at the other. For example, we have seen earlier the outages, total outages that are several thousand lost reactor days for technical reasons. But it's interesting to see that it's up to over 6 gigawatts of capacity that is unavailable at the same time. And that is significant because it's roughly 10% of the installed nuclear capacity. The other surprise was that the dominating cause of outages that are unavailabilities that are linked to climate is the flow rate in rivers. So it's not so much the temperature, it's really the flow rate, not enough water that is available. And that happens more in the month of September rather than in the summer months, interestingly enough. So we see also that if we look year by year, there hasn't been a trend in overall trend in increase, with the largest losses, production losses in 2020. And we see that there are some reactors or some sites that are very significant compared to other sites. Here, Show, for example, is the dominating loss maker. Now, we always have a chapter on global developments in the renewable energy sector, especially solar and wind as examples, because they're dominating, as we can see here, in investments. Most goes into solar and wind. This is a comparison with nuclear investments. Now, this is sort of a back of an envelope calculation on nuclear because there are no publicly available databases. So what we decided to do is to follow a logic, always the same logic, is we apply the investment decision, so a construction start at a given site, and the estimated project cost. We apply that to the year of the construction start. So the basic message here is that there is at least a factor 10 difference in amounts invested in renewables versus nuclear. Now the output is correspondingly. So while we see pretty much a stagnation in output in nuclear, we have seen this dramatic increase over the past few, more than tripling of new renewables. And we see that in 2019 figures have been corrected. So it's actually the first time that non-hydro renewable electricity generation outpaced nuclear power generation. The reason is simple. We have seen since 2009 a dramatic decrease in specific costs, 90% decrease for solar, 70% decrease for wind, while we have seen roughly a third increase for nuclear power. That brings us now to a situation where, according to Lazar Bank, that's a merchant bank. It's a traditional, one of the oldest banks in the world. They looking at renewables around $40 per megawatt hour, and we see that nuclear is now at least four times as large as the cost estimates for wind and solar. Going forward, these are interesting estimates from a new study from the International Energy Agency that estimates nuclear little lower than Lazar, but still about twice as much, more than twice as much as renewables, wind and solar. But interesting is that they forecast over the coming 3 decades another 58% decrease for solar, a dramatic decline for offshore wind of 2/3, and still a decline of 14% for onshore wind, while they don't see much possibility to decrease cost of new nuclear. Again, the consequences are obvious also in specific countries. We have seen that China is the only country that is actually building significantly building out nuclear. So it has roughly increased by a factor of 5 the output of nuclear over the past decade. But look at the increase in renewables by more than a factor of 10. So it is now, it's been for a number of years that wind alone generates more power than nuclear, and both together, like solar and nuclear. Again, if we take biomass into account, it's now twice as much as nuclear power. In the EU, for the first time, we have the same situation, that non-hydro renewables are actually outpacing nuclear power generation. But we have also, if we include hydro, we have for the first time renewables that outpace fossil fuels. So this is exactly what we want to see, is an increase in renewables and a decrease in fossil fuel generation. We see a blip, and this is my final slide on this issue. We have seen that in terms of nuclear building, India is number 2 behind China. However, there's not much change. So these reactors stay in the statistics for a long time, while we see this phenomenal buildup of wind and solar. And in output, this is remarkable, because in output, solar and wind now outpace nuclear output by about 50% each individually. So we see the speed of buildup is just incomparable with what happens in the nuclear energy, on the nuclear energy side. And that brings me to the conclusions. I'm not going to go through the whole slide. I will happily share the presentation with the participants later, and the organizations involved. I'm happy to have them upload the presentation for availability for everyone. Just let me make 2 points. The first one is that I'm actually very worried about the increasing gap between the reality, as you have seen it now, of the situation of the nuclear energy industry in the world, and the impression you are getting if you're an observer and if you look into the into the newspapers or watch or listen to the media. There's a huge gap, and that's really frightening. And I think there should be some thinking why that is so. If we look at, and this is this is the other point, and just as a matter of illustration, the net nuclear capacity addition, which is like new grid connections minus the closures of reactors, is a plus of 0.4 gigawatts. That compares with over 150 gigawatts for renewables alone. I mean, that means very simply, you don't need to be an expert, is that the nuclear power development has become completely irrelevant to the electricity generation technology capacity markets in the world. That is the market situation we're looking at today. And I thank you very much for your attention. With that, I will hand it back to Carl as the moderator, I guess.
Mycle Schneiderovi za jeho prezentaci. A vzhledem k tomu, že prezentace my neupěli otázky v sekci Questions and Answers, tak bych vás poprosil, abyste tam otázky doplnili nyní. Já bych si dovolil položit sám. A to, jestli si pan Schneider myslí, že navzdory tomu celosvětovému trendu je možné, aby jako například Česká republika úspěšně postavila svoji strategii energetickou na rozvoj jaderné energetiky.
Well, as you have seen from the presentation, I'm a big fan of empirical analysis. So we are looking at the past and the current status. If that gives any indication to the future, it seems very unlikely that major nuclear programs get off the ground anywhere. And this is not specific to the Czech Republic. But it's also a question of, I think that there should be scrutiny of those strategies in light of the market situation, in light of the cost issues, in light of the potentials that are available today in energy efficiency to begin with, and especially now with renewables that have come down so much in cost that it's just to clarify that. I mean, it's today impossible to even operate a nuclear reactor at the costs that we have seen for new solar and wind power plants in Europe. The world record for solar was in 2020 in Portugal. It was not in the Middle East. It's now again in the Middle East, but it was in Portugal at around 11 euros per megawatt hour. That's 1.1 euro cent per kilowatt hour. You cannot operate a nuclear power plant anywhere for that cost. I mean, if today I'm investing a euro into new nuclear power plants and subtracting that investment from more climate effective options that are out there, that are more economic, and on top of it, they're not only more economic, they're much faster to be implemented. Then I'm actually making the climate crisis worse. And I think people need to understand that. The climate emergency requires quick options that are economic. So we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions effectively, a maximum, in a short period of time. If you invest in new nuclear, you do exactly the opposite. you invest into a very expensive option that takes a long time to be implemented. To give you an idea, we have seen from construction stuff, we're talking 10 years. Now, in terms of possibility, even for the most complex renewable energy projects, that is offshore wind, they are now feasible within 2 years, a gigawatt farm within 2 years. So it's not only between 2 and 5 times more expensive than other options, but it's also 5 times slower if you choose nuclear power versus other available renewable or energy efficiency options that often come even at negative cost.
Mám tady jednu konkrétní otázku. Kdybyste mohl odhadnout, nakolik reálné je očekávání tady, že když v roce 2029 začne stavět nový jaderný blok s výkonem 1200 MW v Dukovanech, takže v roce 2036 bude možné jej připojit k síti a spustit.
Well, if we look at, I can only judge from what we're seeing in reality. Those are plans. It's difficult to judge about plans. But if we judge on the basis of what we are seeing, the industrial experience that we're seeing, I mean, excuse me, but the French nuclear industry has been trying to implement an EPR at home since 2007, and it's not working. And we're talking now at the earliest in 2023. So now, of course, the industry, whether it's EDF or the Korean industry or the American industry, they can say, well, everything's going to be different. The problem is, with that argument, is that I have no evidence for that. So to say that this plan would be realistic, I have no evidence for that. But I have a lot of evidence that it's entirely unrealistic to make that kind of calculation into the future.
Děkuji. Další otázka směřuje dále do budoucnosti a je zaměřena na to, z čeho budeme vyrábět energii v případě, že postavíme uhelné a plynové elektrárny z důvodu klimatické krize a zároveň nebudeme stavět jaderné elektrárny, které by je nahradily.
Countless options. I mean, the great energy thinker, Amory Lovins, always says, think of it as an orchestra. You know, we are not, you know, there's not only drums or the first violin, there's a lot of instruments, and that is the same thing. We have to think the same way in energy. What we have come from is a vertically integrated system. We have had the idea to build ever larger power plants, whether they are coal or nuclear or gas. Then we ship, transport electricity over large distances and rain the electricity onto end consumers. That's the past system. The future system is not vertically integrated, it's horizontally integrated. It's like the internet. I mean, we're not seeing giant computers. We have computing power is in millions of computers that are interconnected through nodes. And the energy system will very much look the same way. Now, what sources? The sources is one thing, but there's many of them, whether it's solar, thermal solar or photovoltaics, concentrated solar. There's various forms to use wind energy. There is biomass. There is hydro if it's used intelligently, but there's also countless ways to store energy, and we have to make much better use of that. For example, every fridge is a storage facility. Energy is stored in the form of ice in freezers. Energy is stored in the form of hot water. One of the key elements in a future system is what we call demand response. So we need to be able to vary the demand according to the availability that we have through wind and solar, variable sources. So, for example, every freezer is built in a way that you can, if you have a power cut of an hour, you wouldn't even notice it. So the idea is to make use of that possibility. And that obviously only works if we redesign the grid. And the biggest problem we have is to increase the flexibility through the grid or at people's homes. It can also be groups of homes, or it can be an industrial facility, or it can be a university campus that is run in a grid, a microgrid logic. So in optimizing the generation on site and the demand response. It's not a technical issue. It's a problem of strategic planning and implementation. And when people are concerned about grid stability or security of supply, look at the latest results of Germany's grid company. With over 45% of renewables in the electricity grid. The result of grid unavailability in 2020 was the best in the 15 years that the National Grid Company has been monitoring it. Much lower than in a country like France. Much lower. Because the flexibility increases in the system with the buildup of renewable energies. And that's key. It's like the use of electric vehicles. Electric vehicles, if it's done intelligently, will actually be a very major factor of balancing the grid, because you will make use of solar or wind when it's there for storage in batteries. Obviously, if it's done stupidly and everybody comes home and there is no appropriate infrastructure to do that, and everybody plugs in an electric vehicle at the same time, we would get to peaks that would be not manageable at all. So it has to be done in an intelligent manner. And let me say one more thing. I'm a big fan of hybrid approaches. I'll give you two examples. One is in India, solar panels are now massively installed above irrigation canals. Now, that has two effects. It cools the solar panels, so they generate more power, they become more efficient. And at the same time, it reduces the evaporation of water from the irrigation canals. So it's a win-win option. The other example is a French company, Carnal Computing. A fantastic idea. The computing centers, like calculation centers, the most energy they consume is for cooling processors. it costs a huge amount of energy. So they thought, well, let's use the heat, and they install for free processors in people's homes, like an electric radiator, and they pull off the computing results through the web. And you know, the speed of calculation is higher or lower depending on how much heat you take off the radiator. And so they dramatically reduced their costs for calculating. That's their primary business, to sell computing power. They reduce their costs and provide electricity for free, heat for free to people or for offices. That's intelligent thinking. We need to engineer those options that are hybrid uses wherever they can be.
Děkuji. Další otázka se zaměřuje na prodlužování životnosti reaktorů. Například společnost ČEZ má v plánu prodloužit životnost reaktorů v jaderné elektrárně Dukovany na 60 let, které byly postaveny v 80. letech. Máte, jaká jsou s tím rizika? Můžete odpovědět na tuto otázku?
Well, the first risk is that it's highly uneconomic. While lifetime extensions have shown to be often, not always, but often more economic than building new nuclear power plants, still we're seeing now that longer lifetimes are problematic in terms of output. Again, look at the French example. We have done a very detailed assessment in 2019, and people can go to the World Nuclear Industry Status Report, the edition of 2019, for details. We looked at if you have an outage of a reactor, like let's say EDF takes a reactor off the grid for 1 month for refueling and for maintenance. But in reality, it's not 1 month, it can be 2 months. It can also be 3 months. On average, the outages were 40% longer than anticipated. 40%. We're talking something like 1,700 outage days, reactor outage days. That's very costly. The French Court of Account made it very clear that in a sensitivity analysis that the productivity of a nuclear power plant is a key ingredient to economic competitiveness. And we've seen in other markets, like in the US market, we've seen that reactors are being actually closed because they had actually already the lifetime extension. So they did the investments necessary to obtain the license, and they're closed at early ages. To give you an idea, 23 reactors in the world have been closed over the years 2016, the 5 years 2016 to 2020. And the average age of those reactors was around 43 years. So many of those reactors actually had lifetime extensions licensed, but they're shut down anyway because they're not economic to operate. So risk number one is economic. Risks number two are very difficult to quantify, but they're safety risks. I mean, is it so complicated that if you actually use a car that is 20 years, 30 years, or even 40 years old, well, excuse me, but then maybe that is slightly riskier that you have component failures than in a car that is brand new. So, you know, nuclear facilities are, the only thing is they are much more massive and have many more thousand components that can potentially fail. So it is, you can only backfit a reactor to a certain extent. Beyond that, and there's, I encourage people to look at a study that was done by the International Risk Assessment Group. It's an international group of independent experts. They have looked in detail at the safety risks of lifetime extensions. This study is on the web at inrag.org.
Otázka z trochu jiné oblasti a všímá si tématu, které je ve zprávě o stavu jaderného průmyslu zpracováno možná poprvé, a to v korupční oblasti v jaderné energetice. Tazatel upozorňuje na to, že oblast energetiky a průmyslu je velmi úzce propojená s politickými špičkami a že několik velkých hráčů má velmi těsné politické kontakty. A ptá se, jestli máte podobnou zkušenost i z ostatních zemí ve světě a takovou zkušenost by z toho Česká republika mohla odnést, nebo jak by s tímto tématem mohla.
Yes, my experience from other countries is very clearly very similar. I mean, you have differences in separation of utilities from politicians from country to country. Like the rules are not necessarily the same. But as we've seen in the United States, for example, and we've seen in other countries, in Japan, also, for example, massive corruption ongoing between politicians and utilities or other parts of the nuclear industry. So close links do exist, and the point that was made in the question is very significant. It's that the fact that we're not talking about a large number of possible suppliers. We're talking about a very small number of players, and so that lack of option increases the probability or the sensitivity to corrupt activities and bribery very clearly. And it is we have covered these issues for a long time, but we have never actually pulled them together. So we covered them in the country sections in the report, but this is the first year we pull everything together, and it was quite shocking. The result is quite shocking that it's so massive that you can actually find examples for we have looked at the top 8 countries by installed capacity or by operating capacity. And you find in all of these countries, you find examples of criminal activities. By the way, that can be corruption or it can be other illegal activities. Corruption is not the only illegal activity. There's a broad range of, there's falsifications. Counterfeiting is a big issue. It's such a big issue that the International Atomic Energy Agency wrote a separate report on it. So falsification and counterfeiting of parts is a really big problem throughout the industry. And obviously we have other issues like sabotage, insider sabotage, which is a huge problem and one of the most serious risks for the industry.
Děkuji. Zaměřuje na téma, ke kterému je ve vaší zprávě zpracována samostatná kapitola, a to na náklady na likvidaci jaderných elektráren, a otázka je rozšířená o to, jaký je hlavní problém s likvidací reaktorů po končení jejich životnosti.
we have seen, and it's an interesting parallel to the story of reactor building. We have seen throughout the country cases a phenomenon that where two factors change all the time. That is, it becomes more expensive, more and more expensive. Then, so the cost estimates are increasing steadily, which makes it very difficult to actually establish funding in whatever form, but you know, have some kind of fund reserved that is appropriate for covering all the costs, because the costs keep increasing throughout the world. The second, sorry, I should add that the experience of full decommissioning to what is called greenfield, so that you can use the site for other purposes, is very small. We're now getting towards almost 200 reactors that have been closed, and only 10 have been decommissioned to greenfield. And those reactors that have been decommissioned to greenfield are mainly very small reactors, or reactors that have not operated for a long time. So they're not typical for reactors that have operated for 40 years or longer, where, you know, there are more contaminated materials, radiation of materials is more significant, et cetera, et cetera. Other issues pop up. So very little experience with actual decommissioning, which means it's particularly difficult to estimate the final costs. And the other component which goes with it is that it takes longer and longer. So it's very rare that projects are actually completed in due time. And so what we're seeing is we have examples where decommissioning is actually, and maybe I can reshare a slide. Let me see, or I prepare that while I'm speaking. We have seen that in several cases now, the time it takes for decommissioning is actually longer than the time the reactors have been operating. So if you look at the time scales of projects from construction to complete decommissioning, you end up having the largest portion with the decommissioning part. So can I share? Is that okay if I share my screen again? Do you get that slide now? Karel, can you see that slide? Okay. So these are decommissioning projects that are technically completed. So technically completed means that the site is not necessarily only half of those. The site has been declared greenfield, so is available for other purposes. The other 10 reactors usually have still some, for example, radioactive waste on the site. Many reactor sites in the United States have, for example, spent fuel still sitting in dry storage on the reactor sites. But what we see is we look at the construction, operation, decommissioning, these three colors. And you see that you know, the decommissioning part in many cases is actually the longest period in the history of those reactor projects. And sometimes it's stunning to what extent this outpacing decommissioning, like you take this Kondremming reactor case, where decommissioning is really by far outpacing construction and operation of the reactor. So that is another very clear phenomenon that we're seeing. And we see also that there's very little change. This is the first time we did the decommissioning status report, and this is 2021. You see that there's one change, one additional completion in 3 years, but even reactors in the hot zone have not much increased in various countries. And interesting also that you know, if you look at a country like Japan that has a huge amount of reactors in the warm-up phase, so in the very early stages of decommissioning.
Děkuji. Další otázka je technická. Domníváte se, že je možné, aby EDF vyvinula dostatečně rychle reaktor EPR2 s nižším výkonem, aby se mohla účastnit tendru na dostavbu Dukovan, a případně zda je stejného technického postupu schopna korejská společnost KHNP.
Those are difficult questions because they're very speculative. You know, what do I think they might be able to do at some point? It's, you know, so you can open up a lot of speculation here. But let me just say again, you know, I'm looking at what is actually happening on the ground. At this point, you know, EDF has been completely unable to complete a reactor under construction since 2007. And we're talking about a design that would be different again from that design. By the way, it's not quite clear to what extent it would be different and, you know, what additional challenges. Every design change is a challenge. And we know that. I mean, again, the EPR has been under development for 35 years. And it's only a design change that is evolutive. You know, it's not a revolutionary evolution. It's an evolutionary design change. It's not a revolutionary design change. So the more you change a design, the higher are the risks that you are not building to time and budget. And I mean, at this point, the French industry has not been demonstrating that. And if we look, you know, EDF Energy is building the Hinkley Point C reactors. EDF Energy has been downgraded to junk, non-investment grade by Standard & Poor's credit rating agency last year. You know, the credit rating agencies have made it clear years ago that new build is credit negative. So it makes credits more expensive. So it's also a risk for utilities to engage into new reactors, and it's a risk for builders to engage in new projects. There are cases like in South Africa, for example, where the national utility Eskom has withdrawn a tender because the rating agencies had threatened they would downgrade the utility if they went ahead with it. In the end, a tender was put out by the by the state, and the entire state was downgraded by the credit rating agencies. And of course, the whole tender, the whole agreement that came out of it was nullified by the courts in a later step. So that's another story. But again, it's difficult to speculate. But if I judge on the grounds of what is the industry, the industry's pressure right now is on dealing with their own operating reactors and to finish the reactors that they have under, in building elsewhere, in Finland, in the UK, and in France. And these projects are not demonstrating building capacity. That to on time, on budget. That's for sure.
Děkuji. Další otázka je poněkud jiného typu. Když jste mluvil o poměrně složitých řešeních, jak transformovat energetiku, nemyslíte si, že je velkým rizikem to, že náhrada fosilních paliv jaderným reaktorem je daleko srozumitelnější a jak to udělat, abychom veřejnosti vysvětlili, že transformace energetiky je možná i jiným způsobem?
Let me take an image that that I find very compelling. In the comparison between nuclear and solar, for example, we are basically being told that it's easier to think about storing radioactive materials for 100,000 years or something like that than it would be to store solar power for 24 hours. I think this is quite a compelling image. Yes, there are challenges to rebuilding the energy system. It's very clear, but it's very clear also that solar power is very has been around for a long time. It's not a technical issue. The energy, the electricity sources and energy provision, services provision are not technical issues. They're an issue of the right strategies and political decision making. And that is so important to understand. I mean, people like solar power, and actually also wind power in most places have very high acceptance ratings, including in countries like France. In France, and we put up a very interesting chart on the public opinion in France. Solar and wind gets a much higher acceptance rating than nuclear power in France. And so it's not, the public doesn't have to be convinced about renewables. It's the policymakers that have to make decisions to rebuild the system. That's very clear. And the feasibility is being demonstrated every day in many parts of the world.
Děkuji. Další otázka vás postaví do fiktivní, nezvyklé situace. Kdybyste měl poradit české vládě, z kterého dodavatele by si měla vybrat, zda francouzského, korejského nebo amerického, a neměl byste možnost že žádného, tak byste jí odpověděl.
That is absurd. Not choosing one is I mean, to me, the key point here is scrutiny of the not only of the technical choices, but of the strategy as such. And, you know, when we, please just think back of all of these slides that I've shown. It's the past decade, in the past decade, that, you know, the energy revolution has started. It's not something that might be coming, or that you know, is something that is being discussed. It's underway. So to say today, well, which supplier for an option that is actually an option, whether it's American, South Korean, or French, it's an option where the Czech Republic would invest money that makes the climate crisis worse. And you asked me, which of these worse options is worse than the other? I don't think that makes sense. I think that it's the strategy needs to be discussed, and the strategy should be discussed in light of what the strategic options are, and there's many out there. There's many other options than building nuclear power plants. That's for sure. You know, never forget that you know, there's only 33 countries that actually operate nuclear power plants. That's like 15% of the countries that are represented at the UN. So it's you know, it's a small minority that is actually involved with that technology. And you know, it's being I also think that, you know, when, you know, there is this position like of the French government to say, well, we will be doing renewables and nuclear power. At some point, you have to make a choice. It's very clear, because these options become contradictory. The big problem we have now is that the new system in which we are engaging is a system where this whole idea of baseload, so a technology that provides electricity in a steady way. Leave aside now that this is not happening anyways right now, because the productivity of many nuclear plants is so low. But the idea of having a technology that provides power as baseload 24 hours a day, this is flying out of the window. Because if you engage in wind and solar and hydro and others, a large share of that baseload is already covered by solar and wind and hydro and biomass. So what that means is what you leave for large other plants like coal or nuclear or even gas is increasingly in hours where it has to compete with technologies that, you know, that can deliver almost for free electricity. So you get to a lower level of productivity. So nuclear or coal becomes even less economic because they run only fewer hours. And it's also technically not adapted. I mean, a nuclear power plant is meant to be running a maximum that it can run for technical reasons, and not going up and down. So the key word in the new system is flexibility. Flexibility. We have to gain flexibility. And nuclear plants are the most inflexible option there is. So sorry, no answer.
Děkuji. Další otázka směřuje k tomu, že země jako Česká republika je v současné době závislá výhradně, nebo prakticky výhradně na jaderné energetice a fosilních palivech. Podíl obnovitelných zdrojů je zde kolem 10% a v posledních letech obnovitelné zdroje stagnovaly. Tak jestli si myslíte, že je možné v dostatečně rychlé době celé tohleto odvětví restartovat a nahradit ten obrovský výkon jaderných a fosilních elektráren, tak aby jednak nebyl nedostatek elektřiny a jednak aby se podařilo snížit emise.
Well, first of all, I mean, I'm sure there's many experts on the Czech Republic that could answer that question better than I could. But one thing that is very clear is whatever the scenarios are, it is absolutely certain that you will not be able to replace nuclear and coal. And that is not the idea. If the efficiency doesn't kick in and the consumption of electricity does not go down, that it will not work. It's very simple. It's very clear. So in a lot of approaches are not looking into the actual problem of energy services. And let me say a couple of words on energy services, what I mean by that. You know, nobody needs kilowatt hours, or tons of coal or cubic meters of gas. What we need is the energy services that come with it. That is the key. And what do I mean by energy services? There's only 6 categories. It's cooked food. Everybody needs cooked food. Then there's lighting, then there's heating and cooling, and then there's mobility, and there's communication, and there's motor force. If you think about your life, you can put everything that has to do with energy in one of those categories. The job of energy policymakers is to provide the population with affordable, intelligent energy services. It's of no good if you have, 2/3 of electricity provided by nuclear power in a country like France, but many households cannot afford to pay for it. So it's not the access to electricity that is crucial. It is that people are warm, that people have cooked food, and that people have lighting at home, not sitting in the dark. So we have to rethink that approach. So if any country, I mean, the Czech Republic, the Czech people are well known to be, superb engineers, right? Where are it needs a focused engineering effort to come up with options that are engineered options to provide energy services. For that, people need to understand what they are. And a home, everybody knows, a new built home, should be done in a way that they were called zero energy homes, in the sense that you didn't need to bring in energy from the outside. Today, we're technically at the plus energy homes. We can build buildings that actually gain more heat, more light, more everything from the environment and can generate surplus electricity through solar photovoltaics, for example. But it would need very clear regulatory implementation. For example, why is it that there is no obligation to include photovoltaics into new built homes? Why is there no obligation to include thermal solar heaters in homes and have insulation standards that are much higher than what is currently practiced in whether it's in the Czech Republic or in other countries? I mean, there's still not even Germany has an obligation yet. They're thinking now about having an obligation in all professional and public buildings for including photovoltaics in new build. But those are issues that have to be accelerated massively. And the other key component is to make it easier. I give you an example. Our house, I'm in Canada now, where we do over 30 years in an off-grid log house, log cabin, we do solar power. It made economic sense at the time, although solar was, 10 times as expensive than it is today. But in Paris, we don't have solar because we don't have a south roof. We have many trees around it. Very difficult. Why shouldn't I use the roof of my neighbor? He has a large roof that would be sufficient for both homes or even 3 homes. But administratively, it's impossible. It's very complicated to do something like that. So we need innovative approaches to administrative regulations that allow for massively increasing this kind of uses.
Děkuji. Dostal jsem informaci, že paní senátorka Seitlová chce položit otázku, ale nedaří se jí to přes platformu Questions and Answers. A chtěl bych poprosit organizátora, aby umožnil vstup přímo do vysílání.
Ano, je to již možné, dobrý den.
Já vás slyším.
Ano, dobrý den. Tak já děkuji za tu zajímavou přednášku, kterou jsme teď slyšeli a odpovědi na otázky. Jednou z důležitých otázek, která mě zajímá, je naprosto konkrétní otázka, která se týká teď informace, která zazněla jako japonské elektrárně Fukushima s tím, že bude stát asi 300 miliard její likvidace. Já bych se chtěla ještě k tomu zeptat, jestli máme nějaké konkrétní údaje, kolik tedy v tuto chvíli, vím, že se hovořilo o delší době a že se ceny stále zvyšují, ale kolik by v tuto chvíli stála likvidace například jaderné elektrárny Dukovany a jestli těch 300 miliard za Fukushimu je reálních.
We have actually a chapter, a very extensive chapter, like a status report on the Fukushima issues in the report. And one of the sections is on the cost estimates. It's interesting to see that there's a huge variety of estimates that are out there. A range, not a variety, a huge range of estimates. And unfortunately, there are just 2. One is the government estimate, and one is an estimate by an independent traditional economic research institute. The biggest reason for the differences that go above, like in the independent estimate, that go above $700 billion is how do you treat contaminated water? Like it's, you know that there's on one hand, there is the decommissioning process. It's still unclear how this would be done. How can you actually make a cost assessment when you don't have the methodology yet to recover the molten fuel from the destroyed reactors 1, 2, and 3? So it's very provisional anyhow. But the biggest difference between both estimates is, you know, how do you treat the water? Because that's very expensive, and you know that the government wants to dump the contaminated water into the ocean. Over 70% of that, close to 3/4 of the water that is stored there, and we're now talking over 1 million cubic meters, has to be reprocessed. So it has been undergoing some decontamination process, but it has to be reprocessed in order to be below the regulatory limits, and then it has to be diluted by a factor of about 100 prior to the release into the ocean. And we are talking over a 30-year period. I mean, it will take decades to do this, actually. So, and the contaminated water management is only one problem, of course, of the entire decommissioning project at Fukushima. Now, the Japanese government wants to release the water, the tritiated water, so doesn't not want to take off the tritium, separate the tritium out of the water prior to release. And if you did that, if you extracted, that's very expensive. So it's an additional cost factor for the decommissioning strategy when it comes to water treatment. So, but again, I mean, these estimates are very provisional, and they've been, I mean, the government estimates have increased substantially over the last 2016 estimate and keep going up. But I warn to compare this with tech decommissioning issues. I mean, a nuclear power plant that has undergone a full-scale core meltdown is a different project than decommissioning a reactor that has operated without a major accident. So I would not compare these two situations.
Za odpověď a vzhledem k tomu, že nám vypršel čas, tak poděkuji Myclu Schneiderovi za přednášku, za všechny odpovědi. Vám všem poděkuji za účast, poděkuji tlumočnicím za jejich práci a kdyby měli nějaké doplňující otázky, tak je určitě možné přes organizátory získat odpovědi i po skončení tohoto webináře. Děkuji vám za účast a přeji vám hezké odpoledne.